He spoke at the George Bush Library in College Station, Texas. This event's an hour and 10 minutes.
Good morning. My name is Roman Popadiuk. I am the Executive Director of the George Bush Presidential Library Foundation. I am delighted to welcome you to today's Kay and Britt Rice Lecture Series featuring Andrew Card, White House Chief of Staff. This is a very special occasion for the Foundation to host Mr. Card. Mr. Card formerly was a board member of the Board of Directors of the Foundation. Sadly enough, this is also a special day for all Aggies throughout the United States and the world. Today marks the 3rd anniversary of the tragic bonfire, and I ask you to join me in a moment of silence in remembrance of the young men and women who died in that tragedy. Thank you. Their memories will live on forever in all Aggie hearts. I would like to acknowledge Kay and Britt Rice for their generous support of this lecture series. I am delighted to note that Kay Rice has been able to join us this morning. Kay, thank you and welcome. Also joining us this morning are students from St. Joseph High School and A&M Consolidated High School. The robotics teams of these two schools are going on to compete in the National BEST, that's Boosting Engineering, Science, and Technology competition, which will be held at Rita Rita on November 23rd here at the Texas A&M campus. In addition, 2 other Brazos Valley schools will be competing in that competition. Those are Leon High School as well as St. Michael's Academy. I congratulate all those teams and wish them the best of luck. In addition, we have students from Caldwell and Brazos Wood High School. Welcome to those students. I mentioned at the outset this is a very special occasion for the Foundation. I had the opportunity to work with Mr. Card when he was in President Bush's administration back in the early 1990s. He served then as Deputy White House Chief of Staff. Mr. Card has an impeccable reputation for honesty, integrity, and for dedication to country and professional expertise. Above all else, in Washington, he is known simply as a nice guy, and that's saying a lot for people in Washington. So I'm extra pleased to have him here today with us. Mr. Card will speak for approximately 1/2 hour, after which he'll be happy to take questions from the audience. Those of you who would like to address the questions to Mr. Card can do so by using the microphones that will be available to the front of the auditorium. I would like to remind our guests that following the lecture, there will be a reception in the library rotunda, and you're all welcome to join us. I would also ask that at the conclusion of the program, everyone remain seated so that Mr. Card and his guests can proceed to Auditorium B. We do have an overflow crowd this morning, and we have approximately 200 guests in the adjoining auditorium viewing the proceedings on closed-circuit television. Mr. Card has consented to take a few questions from that audience and to visit with them, so I indulge your patience at the end of the program. At this time, it is my great pleasure to call upon the 41st President of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a warm welcome for President George Bush.
Thank you all very much. Please be seated. Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be back here at one of these marvelous forums. I don't know, I didn't listen attentively to Roman, but I don't know if he introduced you to our new United States Senator for Texas, John Cornyn, who is here with his wife, Sandy. Upward. And very proud of him, and of course, Congressman-elect Carter, please. And his wife, Erica. And also, man you all know well, and I know very well, and very proud of, President of the University, Bob Gates, Becky here. But My job today is simply to introduce Andy Card, one of my closest friends and a guy for whom Barbara and I, and more important, the President and his wife, have enormous respect. Andy is distinguished himself, and you can read the thing here about him being Secretary of Transportation. He went down there right in the wake of the horrible hurricane in Miami, south there, and did a beautiful job on that. And everything he touches, he does a first-class job. But he now is the Chief of Staff to the President. He is totally objective in being sure that the views of others get to the President, and yet he runs the White House with a firmness that is exceptional and very, very good. So we're delighted to have him here today. Roman, our dear friend who runs this place, Ambassador Popadiuk said Andy's going to speak for 30 minutes. Maybe I can ask him to take an amendment and speak, well, for 30 maybe, but the big thing is the questions. So we don't want any hesitancy on the part of you guys to get up there, particularly the students. We'd love, and the high school students too, because this is a rare opportunity to get to ask about how a government functions, the inner workings of the White House itself, how the presidency itself operates. And we could have nobody better to talk about that than our dear friend, former Secretary and now Chief of Staff, Andy Card.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, this is a tremendous privilege for me. First of all, I have the greatest respect for former President Bush and Barbara Bush, and for the people who surround them and have made such a tremendous difference for the country and obviously for the community here at Texas A&M. And I guess it would start with Bob Gates, who is someone that I traveled with an awful lot. We shared wonderful experiences together. And I look forward to getting the wise counsel of Congressman-elect Carter, Judge Carter, and the Senator-elect Senator Cornyn. So thank you for being here. But most of all, thank all of you for being here, and I hope that you will be thinking of questions. I'm going to talk today not about policy, although I'd be glad to answer questions about policy. But I thought first I would tell you a little bit about the job of Chief of Staff to the President. I was very blessed to have an experience in Massachusetts that allowed me to meet people that really contributed an awful lot to our political process and to our democracy. And one of the individuals that I met a long time ago ended up becoming the 41st President of the United States. It was a strange opportunity that I had to meet him because I was a member of the Massachusetts legislature. First of all, there aren't that many Republicans in the Massachusetts legislature. I had just come out of a very tough re-election campaign in 1978, and I was appropriately arrogant in that I was pleased with my victory, and I received a phone call on election night from Senator Bob Dole, who I did not know very well, but I was flattered that he would call me, and he offered congratulations, and he said that he was going to be in Boston that weekend, and would I please find time to meet with him? And I was thrilled. And I said, that's strange that he would call me. He must have very good staff work that told him that I had won the election. And I arranged an opportunity to meet Senator Dole, and I wasn't surprised when he told me that he was thinking about putting together a presidential campaign. Well, I said, I like Senator Dole, but I'm not sure that he would be my first choice to be President of the United States. And so I went back to my home, and I wrote a letter to everyone who was running for president on the Republican side of the ticket. And if you think about it, there were an awful lot of candidates. Most of you don't remember these people, but there was Ben Fernandez, and Phil Crane, and Lowell Weicker, and John Anderson, and Howard Baker, and Ronald Reagan, and Bob Dole, and George Bush, and John Connally. And I received letters back from every single one of those potential candidates except for John Connally. He was saving all his money for that one delegate from Arkansas. And I ended up being very fortunate to be able to meet with almost every one of these candidates. And I remember Ambassador George Herbert Walker Bush coming by my very small cubicle in the Massachusetts House of Representatives to say hello. When he arrived, I was not really paying much attention because I was on the telephone. In my room that I had my office in was really very, very small. In fact, the door was either open or closed. You couldn't have it halfway open, or you wouldn't fit in the room. And I was on the phone, and I remember talking away on the phone. And finally, my assistant came in and said, "Someone has been waiting to see you for a while." And it was George Bush. And he came in, we sat down, and we had a wonderful conversation about policy and about people. And then he left. The secretaries in the office, the young interns, the pages were abuzz. Now, they'd seen several other prominent Republican leaders come through that office. But there was a buzz that was different with these young people that day. They really liked George Bush because he cared so much about what they were doing, and he asked what they thought. That started a political love affair that I will admit to. I love George Bush. Obviously, I signed on, and we had wonderful experiences. And one of the experiences was a forgettable campaign for governor of Massachusetts. In 1982, I did run for governor, and I think that I am very fortunate that I didn't win. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts is probably more fortunate that I didn't win. But I was then asked if I wanted to come to Washington, D.C. and work. And I remember meeting with the staff of then Vice President Bush and some of the wonderful people that helped him be a great vice president. Opened doors of opportunity that I never dreamed would be possible. And another fellow Texan, Jim Baker, helped create an opportunity that allowed me to work with President Reagan in the White House as liaison to the nation's governors and statewide elected officials. This is now the lead-in to the story of working in the White House. I was very excited when I arrived at the White House to work in the summer of 1983. I come from a small town south of Boston. I was educated in public schools, never felt that I had been financially privileged, but I had been wonderfully privileged to grow up in a family that cared a lot about politics and people and government. And I showed up at that White House, didn't want anyone to pinch me in case it was just a dream. I had a little red Chevy Chevette that I drove in, and I parked on West Exec, right near the Vice President's limousine. And the very first meeting that I had to attend in the West Wing of the White House was in the Roosevelt Room. The Roosevelt Room is one of the more functional rooms in the West Wing of the White House. It's a small conference room, a table, and I was in that room to have a meeting on acid rain policy. And I had done all my homework, and I showed up early. And when I walked into the Roosevelt Room, there was a woman with name cards. And I went over and introduced myself. I said, "I'm Andy Card, I'm new on the staff, and I wanted to say hello." And she said to me, "Are you Baker or Meese?" I said, "No, I'm Andy Card." And she said, "Who do you work for?" And I said, "The President of the United States." And she said, "Where do you work?" And I said, "Intergovernmental Affairs." And she said, "Baker." My name came out of this pile of cards, and it went on one side of the table. I assume all the Mies people were on the other side of the table. I say that story because it really did define the White House. All of us expect the White House to be defined by the president. But I learned that moment that the structure of the White House and who the chief of staff is also helps to define the White House and how it functions. You see, in 1983, when I arrived, the White House was organized by a so-called troika. Jim Baker, Ed Meese, and Mike Deaver. And there were three distinct camps. The Meese people didn't talk to the Baker people. The Baker people didn't talk to the Deaver people. And the Deaver people didn't talk to the Meese people. And if you did, you were either spying or trying to build a bridge that someone wanted to tear apart. And I was troubled by that. And then the White House changed because the troika broke up. Ed Meese became Attorney General, Mike Deaver went into the private sector, and Jim Baker became Chief of Staff alone. And it was a very different White House. And then Jim Baker left Chief of Staff and became Secretary of the Treasury. And a new Chief of Staff came to the White House, Don Regan. And it was a very different White House. In fact, he was assisted by three people that we called the three blind mice. But it was a very different White House. And then you remember that Secretary Regan left the White House as Chief of Staff with a very short letter of resignation and was replaced by Howard Baker as Chief of Staff. And it was a very different White House. And then Howard Baker left as Chief of Staff, and he was replaced by Kenny Duberstein, who was Chief of Staff during the transition, basically, from President Reagan to a new president. But it was still a different White House. I was very blessed to have a chance to work under all of those personalities and to see how the White House changed when the Chief of Staff changed. Then we changed presidents. And we all expected the White House to change. We went from President Ronald Reagan to President George Herbert Walker Bush. It was a very different White House. In all honesty, it was a very different White House, less because we changed presidents and more because John Sununu became Chief of Staff. And I was his deputy. And it was a very, very interesting White House to be in, and a White House with tremendous challenge. He then left as Chief of Staff, and Sam Skinner came in as Chief of Staff. And that was an awkward period of adjustment because I had been the Deputy Chief of Staff to John Sununu, and I knew that Sam Skinner kind of wanted a different Deputy Chief of Staff to serve with him. So I made plans to leave the White House, but then was completely shocked when President Bush asked me to become Secretary of Transportation. And I left the White House and served at the Department of Transportation as the 11th Secretary. Then there was another change in the White House. Sam Skinner left as Chief of Staff, and Jim Baker came back as Chief of Staff. How fortunate it was that I was able to see all of these personalities in the office that is not the Oval Office, but a corner office in the West Wing of the White House. Because I learned an awful lot about how a Chief of Staff can do a good job for a president. And I learned something from every one of those Chiefs of Staff. I also learned some things not to do from every one of those Chiefs of Staff. So I take this job understanding that I didn't apply for it. You don't really apply to be the President's Chief of Staff. It's an invitation that you cannot turn down, and it's an invitation that carries much more responsibility than even the person who made the invitation understands. And I didn't even understand that the President was asking me to be his Chief of Staff when he asked me. I thought he was asking me to be the head of his transition team. But instead he asked me to be his Chief of Staff. I take my job very seriously. And people want to know how long I will be Chief of Staff. There are two criteria under which I do my job. I have to have 100% of the confidence of the President in order to be his Chief of Staff. If I don't have 100% of his confidence, I should not be his Chief of Staff. The other thing is that I have to be able to give the President 100% of my effort, because he will only be President for a short time. And he deserves 100% effort from those who serve him. If I can't give 100% effort, I will leave. And if I don't have 100% of his confidence, I should leave. So I serve, just like all of the others who serve in the White House, with redundancy. I serve at the pleasure of the President for the time being. And that's what the little piece of paper that hangs on the wall in my office says. It's called a commission, and Bob Gates had one of those commissions. Shirley Green had one of those commissions. And it says your name and the state you're from and the position that you hold, but it says that you serve at the pleasure of the President for the time being. When the pleasure disappears, the time being has arrived. So there are no guarantees. But because of those experiences I had in working with Chiefs of Staff, I viewed my job as the following. I am to be the President's staffer, responsible for the rest of the staff. I'm not the Prime Minister, not the President in waiting, not the penultimate decision maker. I'm just a staffer who's responsible for the rest of the staff. And the staff that the President has attracted is remarkable. The President really does attract the best and the brightest from our great democracy to serve him. And the staff does reflect the President's principles and philosophy, as it should. But the staff is the strength to the President's decision-making. And it's my job to make sure that those wise people get to offer their advice and counsel to the President at the right time, on the right issue. So I pay very close attention to what the President does every day. You know, there are only 24 hours in a day, but there are an infinite number of great ideas, and about 280 million Americans that have good ideas that would like to see the President. My job is to make sure that the President has the time to do the job of President in a 24-hour day and is able to get that which he needs to have from staff and paper in order to make the decisions that a President has to make. Now, that sounds pretty simple, except when you think out of those 280 million Americans, actually, how many of you would like to have 5 minutes alone with the President? There are about 3,000 White House staffers that pretend they have 5 minutes alone with the President almost every day. And if the President did have 5 minutes alone with them every day, he could not do the job of President. So I go through a series of tests. It's a pretty simple test. I call it the test of need versus want. If you need to see the President, you will see the President. If you want to see the President, you won't. If you have a piece of paper that the President needs to see, he will see that piece of paper. If you want him to see your piece of paper, he won't. Most people pretend that their wants are really needs. And my job is to scratch away at the veneer to uncover that want. And I have to do that because the President's time is so valuable. Now, you know that it's valuable because he has to make tough decisions. National security, foreign policy, economic policy, domestic policy. Only the toughest of decisions should make it to the Oval Office. That's why we have a president. But I also know in order for the president to make the kinds of decisions that he has to make well, he also needs to have the time to eat, sleep, and be merry. And schedulers sometimes forget that. So I pay close attention to the schedule, making sure that the president does have time to eat, to go to the bathroom, to make a few phone calls, to think, to eat, and to be merry. Now that changes some of the dynamic in terms of need versus want, because the president, it would be easy to tell him he should only be able to do that which he needs to do. I know that he also needs to do some of the things that he wants to do. So when the Texas Rangers come to town and he said, I want to see the Texas Rangers, he gets his wants. But I have to make sure his wants don't crowd out time for his needs. So I even have to police the president. But want is very, very important for him, as it is for any president. He does need time to be merry. This president is a wonderful president because he has so much discipline in his life. The first time I met him, I'm not sure that he exhibited all of that discipline, but he has great discipline, and I see it every single day. First of all, he has the discipline of faith. He has the discipline of family. He has the discipline of time. Meetings with this president start on time and they end on time. And it's because he has great respect for other people's time. He also has the discipline to do his homework. I know that because I give him his homework every night and I collect it every morning. And just like his dad, he finds my mistakes in his homework. He's also very disciplined about making decisions. I've worked with some pretty remarkable people, some of whom I found allowed time to make more decisions than they did. President Bush understands that he should make decisions in time so they can be implemented well. After all, it's not the 90-10 decisions or the 80-20 or even the 70-30 decisions that make it to the Oval Office. Those frequently can be made by other people in government. The president has to make the toughest of all decisions, the ones that are really 50-50. And a good decision can make it at least 51-49. This president understands that, so he makes those tough decisions. And it's because he has the discipline to make the decisions. I want to tell you, there were so many days in 2001 that were remarkable to me. None of us will ever forget, nor should we, September 11th, 2001. That was a day of unprecedented challenge for a president. And I could go into a great discussion about that day when I whispered in the president's ear, a second plane hit the second tower, America is under attack. But instead, I'd like to tell you about September 14th, 2001. Now, that's not a day that you'll remember with any great particularity, but I think it is a day that helps to define what it is to be President of the United States. The president, as I mentioned, is very disciplined, and he's disciplined about showing up in the office pretty early. He gets there at about 6:45 a.m., which means I get to the office about 5:45 a.m., and I greet the president when he comes into the Oval Office. September 14th, 2001, I greeted him when he walked into the Oval Office. And I started to explain to the president what his day would be like. And he interrupted me. And he told me what his day would be like. It was a day that started with the President having a CIA briefing, which is like every other day of his presidency. But it also included a briefing from the FBI director. The first time that a president, in my knowledge, had a briefing from the FBI director about what was happening in our own country. And I remember Director Mueller, who had only been on the job for a couple of weeks, starting off his briefing by talking about how we were building the case for prosecution, or trying to understand what had happened on September 11th. And the President interrupted Director Mueller and said, "No, that's not what I'm here to talk about. I want to know what you're doing to prevent the next attack." Now, you may not think of that as a very big deal, but the culture of the FBI had been a culture where they were looking for spies against America or building cases for prosecution. They weren't focusing on preventing the next attack. The President gave direction to Director Mueller to change the way the FBI viewed their job. That is not an easy thing to do, but it's a phenomenal command from a president to change the way the culture in a huge bureaucracy visions their job. The President finished that FBI briefing and he got ready to go into a cabinet meeting. Now, the President, contrary to myth, does not meet with the cabinet all of the time. But the President had convened a cabinet meeting to talk about September 11th. And I remember as he went into the cabinet meeting, he knew exactly what he was going to talk about. And he started off with a prayer. And then there was a discussion about the attack of September 11th and what we were doing to make sure that there wouldn't be another attack. And there was a briefing from the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense and the Attorney General. And that was a pretty momentous thing to listen to, as the President and his cabinet discussed what had been a horrific attack on the country, and it really did change all of us. But then this President went around the cabinet table and called out to each cabinet member about what their job would be, as he had to focus on preventing the next attack, securing the homeland, and winning a war on terrorism. He said to the Secretary of Education, Rod Page, "Don't forget that we can leave no child behind in education. The education reforms are very important, and we've got to make sure they're implemented." And he went to the Environmental Protection Administrator, Christy Todd Whitman, and he talked about the responsibilities that we have for our environment. And he went to Secretary Mel Martinez. He talked about the hope that comes through housing and how we have to work to find housing for everyone. Talked to Secretary O'Neill about our economy and how we have to get it going again after the shock of September 11th and the need to get our markets opened. And Secretary Chow at the Department of Labor about how important jobs are and how the workers of America are the backbone of America. He went to each cabinet member and he talked about their job. The message he was sending was that he had responsibility for running our government, and that he knew that he was going to be giving a lot more time to a task that he didn't ever expect to have to address: winning a war against terrorism and securing the homeland. If the day had ended after that cabinet meeting, it would have been an unbelievable day. But it didn't end then. The President then talked about convening his War Council, never expecting that that would have to be convened. And then he dismissed the cabinet. and we all got in fancy cars, and we drove up to the National Cathedral. Now, I don't know if you paid attention to the service that took place at the National Cathedral on September 14th. The National Cathedral is a huge building, very ornate, and it was filled with admirals and generals, clergy of every stripe, ambassadors, governors, members of Congress, senators, White House staff, cabinet members, American citizens. And there were beautiful hymns that were sung and prayers that were said. It was a wonderful sermon, probably the last great sermon to the world that Billy Graham would deliver. And the president made remarks. It was a very moving service because it was a service of our resolve in recognition that there is a higher calling and a higher responsibility and a faith that grounds our country. And I remember looking over, and after the president had delivered his remarks and took his seat, as prayers were said, President Bush 43 and President Bush 41 held hands. It was a very private thing, but it was very moving. Now, if the day had ended there, it would have been a spectacular day, truly historic. But that wasn't the end of the day. The president left the National Cathedral and he went out to Andrews Air Force Base, flew on Air Force One up to New Jersey, got off Air Force One and got on the helicopter Marine One, after having been joined by Governor Popadiuk and Mayor Rudy Giuliani. And we helicoptered over to Manhattan. It was a day with a heavy mist. And the helicopter circled around the tip of Manhattan, and you could see smoke billowing from a hole. We went twice around the end of Manhattan, and you could look down and you could see thousands of people climbing over debris. And the helicopter landed not too far from Wall Street. And the president got in a motorcade and went down to what we now call Ground Zero. And the streets were lined and lined and lined with rescue workers. And the Secret Service was nervous because none of these people had gone through magnetometers or been screened. And they were crowding up against the barricade. And the president said he was going to get out of the limousine. And he went over to the crowd that was gathered and he was shaking hands. And there were all different kinds of emotions. Some people were sad. Some people were mournful. Some people were angry. Some people were prayerful. Some people were cheering. Some people were crying. And the president worked his way down through this barricade system until he reached what was a crushed fire engine. And he climbed up on this fire engine and stood by a firefighter who was holding an American flag and gave it to the president. And the crowd erupted. And they were chanting, USA, USA. And I looked over my left shoulder, and there on a scaffolding were a group of workers chanting, USA, USA. But they had a Japanese flag on their arm. They were Japanese rescue workers chanting, USA, USA. And there were a collection of rescue workers from Canada with search dogs. And they were chanting, USA, USA. And you remember the president said, I hear you. The whole world hears you. It was pretty dramatic. And if the day had ended right there, it was an unbelievable day. But it didn't. The president then went to the Jacob Javits Center. In the Jacob Javits Center, with literally thousands of rescue workers getting ready to go out for the next shift. And the president would not be rushed. He went and he spoke to each one of these groups and thanked them for their volunteer service. He patted all of the dogs, rallied on the teams as they were getting ready to go down to ground zero to continue to search for those who were missing. And then the president was escorted to a very large cordoned off area by blue pipe and drape. And as the advance man said to the president, you'll be going into this room, and it's set up such that there's a microphone, and you can go to the microphone and give remarks. We've assembled the families of the policemen and firemen who are missing at ground zero. The thought is that you should go in, make some remarks, and then we'll be leaving. And the president said, I'm not going to the microphone. And he just walked into the room. There were no cameras there. And the president went to each individual, and he hugged them, he prayed with them, he cried with them, and he would not be rushed. He stayed there for over 2 hours until literally every person in that room was touched by the President of the United States. And he didn't do it for him. He did it for all of us. He got in the limousine and we headed off to Marine One, flew to New Jersey, and the president got on Air Force One, but it was not the 747. It was a C-20, a small little plane. And we headed to Camp David, where the president was going to spend the weekend and meet with his war council. On that flight to Camp David, the president was completely exhausted. He was physically exhausted. He was emotionally exhausted. He was spiritually exhausted. And I remember looking over to him and I said, Mr. President, you're a great president. You did everything today that a president could ever be expected to do. You changed the government. You rallied your cabinet and reminded us of the responsibilities that we have to govern. You were commander-in-chief, convening a war council. You led prayers for a nation and reminded us of our higher calling. You rallied the rescue workers and comforted those who had lost a lot. Thank you. The president responded by saying to me, thank you. That's the job of a president. We elect presidents to lead when we can't anticipate the challenge. I saw President Bush 41 lead when the wall came down, and no one could have anticipated that challenge. And he gave new order to a world. I now am blessed to see how our president today leads, and he leads with faith and respect. Which takes me to one last story. And if it hadn't been for September 11th, 2001, or September 14th, 2001, this would have been the day that I would have remembered most about 2001. It was January 20th, 2001. It was a cold, almost snowy day in Washington, D.C. And it was a day that a new president would be taking an oath of office. It's a very short oath. And I was tremendously excited because I welcomed the change. I remember the Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice, took a Bible in his hand, held it out. George W. Bush put his left hand on the Bible, raised his right hand to the air, and he gave the oath. And he gave a wonderful inaugural address. I encourage all of you to go back and read it. And then he left the Capitol and he got in the limousine and led a parade down Pennsylvania Avenue. It was an interesting parade. Not everyone was waving with all of their digits. The president responded with all of his. He marched the last few blocks of the parade and then entered the reviewing stand. And he stayed in the reviewing stand until every unit in that parade passed the president. He stood there because he knew that each one of those units was paying respect to the president and to the presidency of the United States. As the last unit went by, my cell phone rang. It was one of the people who works for the General Services Administration, the janitors, who said, "Mr. Card, would you like to come over to the West Wing of the White House to see if the Oval Office is ready for the new president?" What a privilege it is to get a call like that. My wife, Kathy, and I walked into the lobby of the West Wing of the White House and went through that same Roosevelt room that I talked about. And there it was, the Oval Office. The door was open. You could smell the paint drying. A workman was adjusting the telephones. Someone else was setting up the pictures of the president's family on the table behind his desk. And I went over and stood beside the grandfather clock. And boy, it looked beautiful. And just then I heard footsteps coming down the colonnade by the Rose Garden. And the door from the Rose Garden into the Oval Office opened up. And in walked the new President of the United States. It was one of those private moments, and I should not have been there. I like to say I was trying to hide in a corner, but there are no corners in the Oval Office. The President did not say a word. He looked up at the ceiling, and then there in the ceiling is the seal of the President of the United States. And then he looked down at the floor, and in the middle of the Ronald Reagan rug is the seal of the President of the United States. The President walked to the other side of the Oval Office, and he turned around and he looked at the desk. It's a spectacular desk. It's called the Resolute desk. Linda Casey knows it well. It's a desk that was presented to the United States by Queen Victoria. You see, that desk was carved out of a beam from a ship named the HMS Resolute. It had been cast adrift by some British sailors, was found by some American sailors, brought back to the United States, completely refitted, presented back to Great Britain, and when the ship was decommissioned, Queen Victoria had that desk carved out of one of the beams from that great ship. And she presented it to President Rutherford B. Hayes. And it's been used by some pretty phenomenal leaders of this country. Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, John Kennedy. In fact, the picture of John peering out from the door in the front of the desk, that's the desk. Ronald Reagan used that desk. Well, the President looked at that desk, and there, right on the front of the desk, is the seal of the President of the United States. The President then went behind the desk and he sat down in the chair. Just then we heard other footsteps coming down the colonnade, and the door from the Rose Garden opened up. A gentleman walked in and said, "Mr. President." And the President looked up and said, "Mr. President, It was father and son. They didn't say anything else. They stood together. Tears were in their eyes and tears were streaming down my cheeks. And it was so obvious that these two men had great respect, not just for each other, but more importantly, for the office of the Presidency of the United States. I know what our president does every day. He comes to work with an understanding that his job is bigger than being George W. Bush. It's about being president for us. So it is a privilege to work there. Chief of staffs don't last very long in the White House. The average tenure is about 22 months. I'm about there. But I am so fortunate to be able to work for someone who understands what it is to be president. And I'm grateful to all of you, because you participate in this democracy, for helping to make it possible. And with that, I say thank you, and I'd be glad to answer any questions. Yes.
Mr. Card, thank you for coming. I'm a Bush School student, and my question, you were talking a lot about the different chiefs of staff you worked under, and now you call yourself the staffer in charge of the staffers. How do you deal with staff changes? Particularly, you're losing one of your head communication people this week, and I was wondering, how do you lose people who have been so loyal to the president, and is it hard to replace them? And how do you deal with those sorts of changes?
Sure. Staff changes are always difficult for any White House. Actually, they're difficult for any organization. They're especially challenging at the White House because we function in a very closed environment under tremendous pressure. I like to say my job is to sip tea at the base of Niagara Falls. But any change in staff, almost by definition, means that the White House will change. I talked about the dramatic changes that come when you change a chief of staff. It can be said when you change any of the assistants to the president out. And so we do have to manage that change, but I also think change is something that is good. Working in the White House requires a tremendous commitment of time and energy. And the White House means that you cannot be selfish when you work there. You have to be selfless. And that means that there are sacrifices that are made beyond what you would find in many other opportunities. The president has to be president 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And as a result, his staff has to be at the ready 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's not one of these situations where you can say, the White House is closed today. But I do feel that change ends up being good, and the president benefits by having different players, different thinkers, different levels of energy around him. Although this president, I find, likes to put on a comfortable old shoe, and we are his shoes. And so he's not trying to force change at the White House. He accepts it if it's necessary. So there is no indentured servitude at the White House, and people do leave of their own free will, and that's good. And we have to adjust with that change. But no one, the beauty about our democracy is about the law, not the people. We are a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But the leaders of our government, we don't have to have the czar or the potentate or the king. We just have to have one of us serving in government. And I think the people who work at the White House understand that. It's not about the job that we do, it's about the job that the President needs to have done. And there are lots of people that can do the job for the President. We are just the most fortunate to be able to do it when we're called upon to do it. But there are others very able. So I welcome change, and I know that there are other people that would be wonderful chiefs of staff, just like there are other people that would be wonderful communications directors or press secretaries or White House counsels. The President does attract the best and the brightest, and if he doesn't, keep that myth alive.
Mr. Carter, I'd also like to thank you for coming and joining us today. My name is Barry Hammond. I'm a senior student here at Texas A&M University, and I wanted to ask a question about one of the attributes of the White House, that, especially this White House, that has been praised by both Democrats and Republicans, and that is the fact that this president has been able to attract not only the best and brightest, but also people that have been very loyal, and has been praised for having a staff that is exceptional. What are those qualities that this president has looked for, other than highly successful people, to ensure that he has the best staff available to any president?
I think one of the great qualities of our president is he knows that he is not always the smartest or the only one to have a solution, that he welcomes advice and counsel, and he expects us to offer advice and counsel in an unvarnished way. When Karen Hughes left the White House, she gave to some of the White House senior staffers a piece of wood that had been carved into the seal of the president. And it was beautifully carved, but it was presented to us without a finish on it, so that we would be reminded of the need for us to give unvarnished advice to the president. And I think that's what helps to have a good staff. The people who work for the president are loyal to him, but do not view that loyalty as exceeding their responsibilities to serve all of you. And so we do tell the president like it is. I had to deliver some pretty tough news to this president when I was deputy chief of staff. I mean, those duties we usually know you cannot take the Ranger on the helicopter. But I have to deliver some pretty tough news to the president every once in a while, and it's news that he doesn't want to hear. And I think that's the fact that our president keeps a door open and welcomes hearing advice like that, allows those of us who are around him to do our job and feel comfortable how we do it. You know, our democracy is such that it's an open door, it's an invitation to participate. And most of the people who are working around the president walked through that door and helped in campaigns or helped work in government. State government, local government, federal government. They worked on campaigns. They worked in the private sector, and they helped in campaigns. And I think that our participation in the political process goes an awful long way toward making sure that the president gets a breadth of experience and advice from his staff, and that helps to engender more loyalty. The president also is extremely respectful of those that walk into the Oval Office, just as those who walk into the Oval Office are very respectful of the office of the presidency. So he knows that if we're there to see the president, there must be a good reason for us to be there. And even if he disagrees with the advice and counsel that he might get, he respects the advice and counsel that he gets, and that helps to make a staff feel more comfortable in how they do their job. But I would say it's the participation in the political process that helps to build confidence and loyalty, but it's service to country that I see this president as being the test that all of us are expected to pass.
My name is Alex Cole. I'm a senior at St. Joseph's School, and my question for you is, what do you believe are some ways for a person of my age to become politically involved?
Well, first of all, participate in the election process. You don't look like you're old enough to vote yet, but when you get old enough to vote, vote. But even before you get old enough to vote, you can help in a campaign. And campaigns take on many different forms. You can campaign for candidates, or you can campaign for causes. And sometimes you can campaign for a candidate and a cause at the same time. And I would encourage you to do it. I'm going to tell you one quick story. Linda Casey has heard this so many times, you won't want me to repeat it. But I grew up in a small town south of Boston, Holbrook, blue-collar community. My parents were very, very young when I was born. And I got to spend a lot of time at my grandmother's house. It sounds like it was a long way away. It was not. It was across the street. But I must have been a challenge to my parents because I was sent to grandmother's house all the time. And my grandmother, when we gathered for the evening meal, we'd sit around the dining room table, and she would remind us frequently about a picture that hung on the wall. And it was a picture of her marching down Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, wearing a white dress. She had been a suffragette. And she was very proud of that picture. And when women got the right to vote, she voted. She ran for office, got elected to the school committee in Holbrook, and served with great controversy on that school committee because she was a woman, and she was pregnant while she was on the school committee. But as we gathered around the dining room table and that picture was there, she would then require us all to say the blessing. But before we could pick up our fork and begin to eat, she went around the table and required that everyone had to repeat something from the newspaper that day. I was great. Red Sox won. I knew the comic strips. The weather never seemed to work. But eventually, almost every conversation turned to politics or policy. So I knew the name of the state representative and the state senator and the school committee and what was happening at town meeting and what was going on Beacon Hill. And it was part of our regular conversation at the dining room table. After I got married and moved back to Holbrook with a wife and kids, I moved in with my grandmother. It was the same thing. Tell me something from the newspaper today. I ended up getting involved in local politics and served on the planning board. Thursday nights, 7 to 9, no pay, 5-year term. And then I bought a house and my grandmother came in and moved in with me for a little while. And then it was Christmas Eve, 1971, that my grandmother was taken to the hospital. And my father and brothers and I went over to visit her. And she told us that night that she was going to die. It wasn't sad, though, because she started to explain all of the wonderful things that had happened in her life. And then she wanted to talk to each one of us alone. And my youngest brother went in, then my next brother, then I went and I sat beside her and held her hand. And she said, "Andy, tell me something from the newspaper today." We started talking about the planning board, the school committee, what was happening on Beacon Hill, what the governor was doing, the school committee budgets. And she said, "Andy, continue to participate in politics. Because if people don't participate in their government, democracy will die." She died that night. And it was the most wonderful curse that she could have laid upon me. Because whether you like it or not, I'm participating. So, Alex, I say to you, read the newspaper and argue about it, and then get involved to make a difference.
Thank you. My name is Tori Porter, and I'm also a senior at St. Joseph's School. And we are currently involved in the Texas Best Robotics Program.
Yes.
And I was just wondering what President Bush is doing to encourage education, and particularly engineering.
I'm an engineer. Believe it or not, I'm an honorary Aggie. And this fellow sitting right in front of me, Felix W. Covington III, right there, is also an engineer, and he was my roommate when I went to the United States Merchant Marine Academy, and I'm thrilled to see him here. But he's a good, close friend, and thanks for being here. But no, the president, first of all, feels that education is the paramount concern that we have domestically, and that really the The opportunities in education should be unlimited for young people, which means we have to give them, young people, the tools to be able to participate in our society by teaching them to read, encouraging them to write, and to understand math. And if we do that right, the bigotry that we find in education will help to eliminate the bigotry that we find in our society. So when the President called for his very first legislative initiative, it was to reform our education system such that no child would be left behind. And it wasn't just a campaign slogan. It was a charge to all of us. And the federal government has taken brand new initiatives to help stimulate responsibility among parents and teachers so that no child is left behind. And the decisions there were not simple. But I'm convinced if you turn young people on to reading, they will learn more about every aspect of our society and our economy, and more will be turned on to engineering, and the rest will help to change the dynamics of this country such that all of our potential can be realized. And it is sad when you see the soft bigotry in our education system today that denies young people a chance to participate so that they get locked out. So I don't know that my answer is specific enough, but I tell you, this president has worked with other governors to highlight the value of education, and specifically even engineering education. I know that he's participated in robotic challenges, if you will, and Governor Jeb Bush in Florida has been a champion of highlighting the opportunities that come through engineering education by sponsoring and co-sponsoring with others these challenges to build great robots by young people, and it's something that the president has embraced as well. So I'm glad you're doing what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, sir. My name is Megan Wood. I'm a first-year student at the Bush School. We talk frequently about decision-making and problem-solving, and Dean Chilcutt reminded us a couple weeks ago that the most difficult decisions are the decisions between two rights. You spoke about the role of discipline in the president's life, and I was wondering what other values or characteristics you see him display in his decision-making.
He does his homework very, very well. I mentioned that he does it. That's something, most people don't expect that this president does his homework. He does his homework. I think it may be because Barbara Bush beat him up so much as a child. But he gets a very thick briefing book every night, and he does his homework. As I mentioned, the decisions that the president has to make are not the easy decisions, so the homework is not easy. And frequently, the decisions are between two right answers. But the president also has confidence in his ability to make the right decision. So he doesn't agonize over the decisions that he's made. He works to implement them. We can get lost in yesterday's decisions. Our president doesn't get lost in yesterday's decisions. Now that requires fortitude. You have to have some confidence in the information that you received when you make the decision. And you have to have a little bit of arrogance. After all, he did run to be president of the United States. And you wouldn't believe how many people think they could be president. And it's not easy to get there. And he is the president, and he knows it. And that gives him the right to make the right decision when there are two rights. And so he accepts that, and we work very hard to implement the right decision after he's made it. But I don't know that I could offer any more counsel except to say that I watched this president seek out the one moral compass that is always pointing in the right direction. And that's the moral compass that's inside of us. It's not what you read in the law or the regulation or in the briefing paper or through the emotion that comes through a presenter. It's your conscience. And when there are two right decisions, let your conscience be your guide after you've done the homework. And this president does have the character to be able to understand that he has a conscience and that he can listen to it. One last question. I saw you just stand up there, and then Roman is giving me the hook.
Thank you for that. I am Mrs. Ordinary Citizen, but I really want you to convey things to the president for us. He has sparked in us a new pride in the presidency, and he has given us hope for good times to come. And I would like you to convey to him our support for these moral attributes that he exhibits to us. I think that's the very most important thing he can do for our youth. I really want you to tell him that we support his moral fortitude, and let him know that America really cares. The ordinary people know what he's doing for us, and we really care and appreciate.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Please remain seated until Mr. Card and his party depart and visit with the guests in Auditorium B. Thank you.